Hello, my name is Rysz, and I'm the Assistant Director of Career Services for the College of Arts and Sciences. I work out of our Mosley Center, the main office for the Student Professional Development Center, where we serve students for a variety of appointments, including resumes, cover letters, and my favorite, mock interviews. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit more about interviewing and elevator pitches and how you can put your best foot forward in these scenarios. I'm going to go ahead and shut off my video so that it's not a distraction before we get started. So I'd like to begin just by talking a little bit more about some important steps to start before you're even faced with the interview, right? So after you submit your resume, you might have received an email from HR, email from the company, we're ready to schedule an interview with you. So before your interview, I think it's important, to not only practice your elevator speech or pitch, you'll hear me refer to those interchangeably. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about those moving forward. But I think it's also helpful to review your resume, right? So just as much as you're doing research on the company, what's also helpful is knowing which version of your resume you submitted, right? Because you might have multiple. You might be applying for multiple opportunities. So just doing a quick review, quick refresher, in case you're asked a question from your resume, that you'll be able to answer that a little bit more confidently. And I think not only researching, either the specific position or the company, but both, right? How does the role that you're applying for, how does it fit in with the company's? I think that's really helpful. Another thing that you can do, which might seem obvious, but for some, we might not have done this before, but mock interview. And that is an appointment type that you can schedule through the Student Professional Development Center, through the Elon Job Network. Again, this is one of my favorite types of appointments because it's exciting to learn more about how students can translate your past experiences, and it's good practice, no matter what. And then I think too, another important key piece is understanding how your specific skill set can apply for the position. So again, going through that job description, making sure you have those key points outlined of how you can be, the best fit for the position. Lastly, I think it's helpful to try to think about what those surprises might be. And what I mean by this is, is there going to be a lunch component to your interview? Are you going to be interviewing with multiple people, or will it just be one person? Knowing even where to park, where do I go when I get there, right? Or if it's a virtual platform, which platform, and how can I best practice and prepare beforehand? So as I mentioned, we were going to get to elevator pitches. So elevator pitches can really help guide who you are. So when an employer asks you the question, tell me about yourself, it's helpful to have a few key things outlined that way you're ready to go and can best answer this question. So typically it's a 30-second method of talking about your skills and experiences and how they align to the job, right? And it's important for a few reasons. It's a commercial opportunity, so it's a great opportunity for you to show that you can be both confident and competent, and it's a good point of reference for getting stuck. I often say this is something that you should practice, but not make it over-rehearsed. So in my line of work, I work with a lot of our students in the performing arts, and I often say it's sort of like an unrehearsed monologue, right? We want to have some of those key components that we know about ourselves, like who are we based on our past experiences. Maybe you had an internship the previous summer and it was at a nonprofit and you loved it, and this allowed you to do grant writing. And grant writing is something that not a lot of students are able to get their hands on. This might stand out and be valuable to the employer. So that's something you'd want to share in your elevator pitch, followed by your goal with this specific company or your goal in working with them. So those key components, again, should include that introduction, your name, your major, some past experiences, the key competencies. Those are the things that you've done in your past internships, jobs, etc., that really might stand out to that employer. And then your goals in specifically working with them. This is something that I think is easy to forget, but super important and valuable to make sure we include, because we want to tailor the elevator pitch to match who we're meeting with. And then add value. And when I'm talking about value, this might be something that can really show them that you've done some research. So looking on their website and seeing, is there a particular mission that the organization supports that you also support, right? That could be a conversation starter, something to get the ball rolling, and then that might make the interview feel a little bit more conversational, which might be a goal. I think the best interviews are more conversational. Some things that we should know prior to your interview, right? Why do you even want to work for them? Again, this goes along with the research that you're doing, right? Try to find something unique, just not, we all want a job, but try to make this really tailored and really specific for the particular employer or company or role. Maybe the role could afford you something that a previous internship couldn't, right? So what the employer has to offer that others don't. And again, it goes back to values, right? So what does the employer pride themselves on? And remember that interviewing is a two-way street. You're interviewing the company just as much as they're interviewing you. So make sure your questions that you have for them are intentional at the end of each interview, right? And can help you make that best decision of whether this would be the best fit for you, right? And can also exude your passion for that company as well and make that shine during the interview process. First impressions are everything. I always think it's better to be over-prepared than it is to be under-prepared. So we want to make sure we're bringing multiple copies of your resume. Even if you know you're only going to be meeting with 2 people, bring extras. You never know if somebody's just going to jump in and crash the interview, right? And we want to make sure we're being respectful and have more copies than not prepared. Bring some water. This might be intuitive, but you might be there all day for a half day. So just make sure you're prepared, bring something to write on, take some notes, show them that you're interested and invested. When it comes to handshakes, you want to be mindful of, again, who you're meeting with. If this is an international opportunity, are handshakes the proper greeting in that culture, for example, right? So be mindful of nonverbal cues just as much as verbal cues during your interview, and do some research again on the company, where they're located, all of that good stuff to really help you be your best self and make a really good first impression. And we want to make sure we're also articulating and speaking clearly. I think during interviews, often we want to rush and get the answer over with, and therefore we kind of speak a little bit more quickly or a little bit faster than we would in regular day-to-day life. So we want to remember the 20-second to 2-minute rule. And this essentially is just keeping your interview answers between 20 seconds and 2 minutes, right? Simple, but you don't realize how much time or how little time goes when you're actually talking, right? And so just want to make sure I'm also touching on some of those nonverbal things. Eye contact, sitting up, sitting straight, sitting forward, showing them that you're interested and invested throughout, not just through your answers. Next, I'm going to transition into talking a little bit about the different types of interview questions that you might encounter. So, traditional questions, I already had mentioned, tell me about yourself as one of those. That's a really good example. You might encounter behavioral questions, case questions, writing tests, or illegal questions. And I'm going to go through most of these. The only 2 that I'm not going to go through in detail are case questions or writing tests. But again, if you have a particular interview and it's a very specific, let's say it's a coding interview that you have coming up if you're a computer science major, or maybe you're an English major and you're applying for something in publishing or editing and you have a writing test, you can always contact our office and we can help you, walk you through, steps to that process. We have advisors who specialize in different areas that are more than willing to help you with those as well. But today, for the focus of the rest of the presentation, I'm going to be talking about traditional questions, behavioral questions, and just how to maybe navigate some of those questions that are illegal that employers should not be asking. Again, as I'd mentioned, tell me about yourself is one of the most common traditional questions that you will encounter during an interview, but some other ones, they might come off, straightforward, right? So what are your biggest strengths and weaknesses? Why are you interested in the company? These are very straightforward questions where you could almost answer them with a yes or no, but we want to avoid that. We want to make sure, again, we're giving them a really succinct answer that's between 20 seconds and 2 minutes. So sharing some of your past competencies, really going into a little bit of detail here with these questions can help. So avoid sort of the short, I think my biggest strength is that I'm outgoing. Right? Give an example of how you might be outgoing. And when you're sharing your weakness, always share how you're trying to work on that weakness or how you're trying to improve upon that weakness. That can really help you stand out. And it makes it feel just that much more authentic as well. So behavioral questions. These are my favorite types of questions to ask a student when we're going through a mock interview, because this is how I really find out about some of your past experiences. So the key with a behavioral question really lies in the name, right? A past behavior is going to be what's most indicative to the employer of how you will perform on the job in the future. So these questions that we have here, so tell me about your greatest accomplishment, tell me about a time you overcame adversity, or describe a time when you had to handle an ethical issue. We might want to do with these questions is kind of give them multiple quick examples of how we've done these things. But really the best scenario here is if you can give a story. Share a story of how, what your greatest accomplishment was. We can share that arc of what the start was, how you resolved it, what was the resolution and the conflict. That makes for a really great interview answer for a behavioral question, because again, they're looking for a particular scenario that they can place here to picture you in that scenario to see how you would best move forward and how you would perform on the job in the future. One of the best ways that we've worked with students that we've encouraged them to think about that method, the behavioral, interviewing, and is using the S.T.A.R method to help. So this really stands for a situation, a task or an action, and a result, right? So your situation, you're all students at Elon University. Your tasks and your actions, these kind of go hand in hand. So you might be doing homework, you might be, getting an interview, you might be going, to your internship. You're doing these key things, and the result is so that you graduate, right? So that you get a job, right? So apply that same method when you're answering the behavioral-based questions. And this can even be helpful for resumes as well. But if you're applying this method, this will really help you come up with some good stories that you can articulate during an interview. And I would suggest even prior to your interview, I know it's hard to say or try to envision what they might ask you, but you can at least come up with a few of these stories beforehand that could be applicable for a few of the different behavioral questions. Because at the end of the day, they want to see how you've resolved something, right? And why they should hire you based on that past experience. So again, use the S.T.A.R method. I think it's helpful. If you're meeting with a career advisor, we can help you walk through what some of these stories might look like as well. So now I just want to touch on what are illegal questions. So during an interview, you might, again, the best case scenario is it's going to be a little bit more comfortable. You're going to feel like this is a conversation, and some topics might come up. You might be talking about what's your favorite, TV show, something in the news recently that you've seen, something, again, maybe more mission-based or values-based that you're bonding over. And that might be all, fine and dandy, but we want to think about sometimes when an employer, might, whether this is a conscious or an unconscious, they might, lead into an illegal question. I've got some questions here on the left-hand side of my PowerPoint. Are you married? What is your religious affiliation? Will you now or in the future require sponsorship? Or what is your ethnic background? So while all four of these are, seem highly inappropriate, only one of them, will you now or in the future require sponsorship, is illegal. So it's interesting because, again, these four kind of seem like they'd all be illegal, but it's important to note that that's really the only one on this list. And so I wanted to provide a few choices you can see on the right-hand side of the PowerPoint, that you can do if you're presented in this scenario. And hopefully you will not, have this scenario. But if you are, you could choose to answer the question if you do feel comfortable. You could refrain from answering and explain, I do know based on meeting with our Student Professional Development Center that this question is illegal, and I would appreciate, based on my skills and experiences, if we can rely on those in order for me to get this job, or reframe, right, and focus on your qualifications, as I had mentioned, and not on personal information. So interviewing variations, I think this is really, really important. And again, happy to meet with students one-on-one if you were interested in scheduling an appointment to go into a deeper dive of how to prepare for each of these. But I just want to share a few tips and tricks for the four of these different interviewing variations that you might encounter. So I know, although we're in a COVID-19 pandemic, in-person interviews are not as prevalent, but typically they are, that sort of last round or the second round interview where it's really the most impactful. So I know a lot of companies have transitioned to more digital interviewing or using a virtual platform, but I think it's important to still talk about in-person interviews, because I know I've heard from students that these are still going on, right, in a safe, respectful manner. So when you're faced with an in-person interview, again, doing your research, I think, is going to be key here. So knowing who you're interviewing with, right? Is it one person? Is it multiple people? Will you have different interviewing chunks, right? Knowing what to bring. There's a really great website called The Muse, and there's an article there, a checklist of what to bring. So I'd highly suggest printing something like that out, bringing a Padfolio with you, a notebook, a folder, just so you can have written down all of those key things that you need, right? And then I have here SOLAR, which probably doesn't mean much just looking on this PowerPoint, but this is an acronym that stands for, remember back to what I had mentioned before, those nonverbal cues, right? So sitting squarely, maintaining open posture, leaning in to the employer, maintaining eye contact, and then just being able to relax, right? I know this is a high stress situation, it's probably not going to feel super comfortable right off the bat, but if you can kind of check your nonverbals just as much as you're paying attention to your verbal answers, how you're articulating things, that really shows an employer that you're invested as well, and that you're the type of person that they might want to hire. Additionally, with in-person interviews, they could be group or they could be individual. So an individual interview is your traditional, you're meeting with the hiring manager, the director of the department that you're going to be working in, and potentially another few people on that side interviewing you. Whereas a group interview might be a few candidates in a room with one interviewer. So it's important to note, and again, checking beforehand which of these interviews that you are actually going in for. It's more common for an individual interview than a group interview, but in a group interview, some of the key things that you want to make sure you're keeping in mind are you being respectful to the other candidates in the room? And are you listening? Or are you sharing, a similar answer that somebody before you gave? So really trying to stand out and be respectful are two of the big key things here. Next, transitioning into phone interviews, which actually might be, your first round of an interview. Some key things that I think are helpful and important are, you have the ability to take notes without somebody even realizing that you're taking notes, right? We don't recommend at all reading off of a template or reading, completely verbatim off of something that you have in front of you. But again, merely to use that as a platform to write down a few key things you want to make sure that you're sharing about yourself, and to take notes, in a way where you're not super obviously showing them that you're paying attention and you're being respectful. And often we want to make sure we're picking a quiet area, because you might, maybe your apartment, maybe you have roommates, maybe you live near the train tracks, right? Try to reserve a room in the library, or reserve a room in a space where that it's going to be quiet and there's going to be less distractions. We want to make sure we have for phone interviews. Again, these are usually your first round for interviewing. Next, I have Skype here, but it could, occur over multiple digital platforms. I'm recording this presentation on a platform called WebEx, which Elon uses, and we also use Zoom. And I know Zoom is another popular platform for interviewing as well. But for these types of interviews, one of the biggest key things is making sure you're dressed professionally. And again, it might feel a little funny, like, why? They're only going to see from my torso up. But if you have to stand up for any reason, like maybe you have an animal, maybe, again, you're living with roommates, something happens, you just want to make sure you're dressed professionally head to toe. And I think when you're dressed well, when you're dressed professionally, it makes it feel more genuine, and it makes the experience feel more real. And at the end of the day, that's what you want. Right? We want to make sure we're articulating very well, because technology can lag. Right? I mean, technology, it's so great. It's moving us forward, but it's not without its faults. So we want to make sure we're testing the equipment, jump on with a family member or a friend over the same platform that you're asked to interview over, just to test it. Test your area too. Does your apartment, does the space that you're interviewing in have good Wi-Fi? Trying to know those things beforehand so that you can plan in the event that it doesn't, and in the event that you have to do something about it, or maybe switch locations. And also, what does the space behind you look like, right? Or do you have a bunch of photos? Is it more of a blank wall? Try to make it a space where there's less distractions, just like phone in the background. The last form of interviewing occurs with digital interviewing. And you might think, well, we just talked about Skype and Zoom, but digital interviewing is a completely separate platform altogether. So a digital interview is typically a recorded interview, a pre-recorded interview that you would submit your answers over a platform. So there's no interviewer on the other side. There's nobody on the other side. So you really have to do your best kind of talking to a blank wall, right? So there's nobody in front of you. So how are you going to practice? Well, there's a resource that our office offers, and it's called Big Interview. And this resource, I can't speak highly of this enough, but it's a fantastic platform. You can practice all different types of interviews, for all different types of industries, regardless of level of what you're going to be applying for. And you can record and practice and send your interview to maybe a career advisor or somebody in your department, somebody maybe in your major that you can get some feedback on to hear how you did, just watching yourself too. While it might be uncomfortable, that's the best practice that you can have going forward. Follow-up. So your follow-up for your interview is just as important as the process before and during. So when it comes to thank you notes, although handwritten might be, you might not make it in time, it still really looks great when a candidate, when a student especially, sends an in-person snail mail, a handwritten note, right? Just taking that extra time or effort to do so is really great. So have your handwritten or email. It really should be, email no matter what. We definitely want to make sure we're emailing, and we want to make sure we send that within 24 hours. But I think going above and beyond and sending the handwritten note as well really makes you stand out. When you're interviewing with multiple people, make sure you get all of their email addresses, because it's really important. And again, it makes you stand out if you email each person that was involved in your interview process. It just makes you, again, shows that you've done your research. It makes you stand out compared to other candidates in the pool as well. And you want to note the hiring timeline. So I mentioned earlier in the presentation, in this webinar, just asking questions, right, to gauge, is this the best place for you? Because interviewing is a two-way street. One of the questions that you absolutely can ask at the end of your intentional questions at the end of the interview is asking them, when you can expect to hear from them, right? So just noting the timeline too can be extremely helpful moving forward. And then providing any follow-up materials. Maybe, this is the time when they're asking for your references. Make sure you have that document prepared. You don't necessarily need to bring that with you to an interview, but it's always a good idea if you have that printed out and ready to go, but also have a digital version of that on Word or PDF ready to go as well for your references, and, because they will ask that. Just wanted to review some of the resources. I know I had mentioned, I talked about at least two of these. So Big Interview is an online digital interviewing platform where you can practice 24/7. So this comes in handy if you're running into, maybe you have an interview in 36 hours, you don't have time to meet with a career advisor in our office. At least go on and use this platform, which is free to students. Our office pays for this platform, Big Interview. All you need to do is log in, create a username and password. You can find this link under the Student Professional Development resources on our website. I think it's a fantastic resource. Again, you can send your recorded practice interview to either somebody in our office or maybe a faculty member to get some advice, some feedback on how you did. And just watching yourself, again, I know it's scary, it's a little intimidating, but it really helps. And then I think still the best way to practice is by actually doing a mock interview with a real person in person, right? And although, for the fall semester, we are going to be conducting appointments virtually through our office, fall 2020, you can still schedule and we can still conduct a mock interview over Zoom or over WebEx, and you can schedule that through the Elon Job Network, where you would schedule any of your appointments meeting with a career advisor. And the last resource that I wanted to just make sure I touched on was Transition Strategies courses. So these are courses that our office offers, that they are 1-credit courses, and they help you with all things career and professional development. These are great courses to add on to your schedule because, again, they're 1 credit, so they're not going to take up as much time, and they typically all have some type of embedded interviewing assistance as part of the course. If you're interested in looking at these, the prefix for, when you're looking at the academic catalog would be COE for cooperative education. Lastly, if you have any questions or want to follow up with us, we can be found at 140 Mosley, the first floor of the Mosley Center. And our phone number is here, 336-278-6538, or by emailing careerservices@elon.edu. Hope you've enjoyed this presentation, and hopefully you'll take advantage of some of the interviewing resources that the SPDC has to offer.